Alright guys, welcome back to F1 News. And after Haas's very strong start to the season, especially compared to last year, suspicions have been raised by at least 3 teams to the FIA about whether the relationship between Haas and Ferrari goes beyond what is allowed in the regulations. The FIA have been asked to investigate. Whether they'll find anything, I guess we'll find out soon. Very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I would greatly appreciate it. Before we get into the Haas Ferrari stuff, wanted to mention real quick, of course, the Imola Grand Prix coming up soon, the Miami Grand Prix not long after that in May. Actually, well, firstly, just Imola real quick. This is the track, this is what it looks like. These are the compounds coming up this weekend. Of course, on the Friday, the qualifying actually begins because it is a sprint race weekend. But not too long after that, we go to Miami for the first time. This is the track right now, which they say is about 95% ready. Sergio Perez actually driving around and getting a feel for what the track might indeed feel like and might indeed look like. This seemingly is going to be the layout. So 3 DRS zones. Kind of interesting actually, especially this final sector. Kind of tricky, turn 11 all the way to turn 16. Might, who knows if dirty air is going to be a problem here, right? Just because these new cars are better for it, but it's one of the more twisty sectors we have seen so far, to be honest. So we shall see. Obviously, right after turn 16, very long back straight. Who knows exactly where the DRS detection zones are going to be? But this is how it works. This is the pit straight, effectively. Turn 1, turn 2, turn 3. Kind of a back curve type straight thing right here. Seems like an interesting track, to be honest. Actually might make for some decent racing. So it doesn't seem tragic as far as I'm concerned, but it's going to be interesting if this is indeed what we see in a few weeks' time in the Miami Grand Prix. So yeah, that's what it apparently looks like. I'm sure plenty more to discuss on this going forwards. But let's dive into these team standings then. So of course, Haas didn't have the greatest result as Australia, both cars finishing outside the points. Before then though, both they had points at both the previous races. Magnussen especially seemed very strong. He had his battles even with Hamilton and Mercedes, right, in both Jeddah and previous to that as well, but looking relatively decent in qualifying. Even from early practice, right, before the season even began, the Haas were looking very good because I think they had some sort of transport delays. They got out there late, they got some extra sessions in the evening, and it was like, Magnussen was going fastest in some of those sessions out of all of the cars. So it does certainly raise some questions. Of course, like last year, Haas pretty much wrote off the development of their terrible 2021 car to make sure this car was better than it could be. But of course, it is going to raise some concerns from the likes of, let's say an Aston Martin or a McLaren or an Alpine, teams that are there in the same ballpark that, aren't necessarily wanting Haas to be competing with them, right? They like Haas when they were at the back of the field. Of course, now Haas all of a sudden, midfield team, potentially top of the midfield, some have said, especially at the first couple of races, it kind of felt that way at times. So questions maybe understandably are going to get raised when, of course, Haas pretty much maximizes the possible, everything it possibly can out of its relationship with Ferrari, as in Ferrari being the supplier. Haas buys everything it possibly can from them and, utilizes that relationship, what is allowed within the rules, to its absolute maximum. So you might well expect, given the fact that Ferrari all of a sudden, they were winning races, look like the strongest team, then Haas also have improved, that whether there's something going on there, right? And we'll talk about the fact that they failed to perform too well in Australia aside, because there's some more theories about that. The Gunter Steiner thinks are completely unfounded. We'll dive into his response here in just a second. So that's the thing. Are these Haas been growing, right? Whether the fact that, yes, they're allowed to buy XYZ, and maybe they shouldn't be allowed to buy XYZ, or maybe there's other things that have been shared between the two teams in terms of design philosophy that was brought over maybe by some engineers that used to be at Ferrari and now working at Haas. We'll see that in a second here. That maybe they've brought some ideas across from Ferrari to make sure the Haas team were better prepared than they would have been this season, and maybe than what some of the other teams were, which of course would be against the rules in that case. This is quite interesting actually, just looking at the two cars side by side. They look, it's not identical by any means. There's some similarities. There's also plenty of differences. To me, looking at these two cars, it doesn't seem obvious, at least looking at these two, that they've taken a very similar design philosophy, like, a few years ago with the pink Mercedes, right, the Racing Point team, whatever they were called, and then of course, now being called the white Ferrari, at least by some people. To me, it's not so identical, but there are certainly some similarities, also some differences though. This has of course been discussed then. So since kind of Haas has come into the picture in 2016, they've certainly been up and down, but they buy about 70% of its car from Maranello, right, which is where Ferrari produce some of the stuff. So everything they possibly can buy from Ferrari, they do buy it. Of course, they've only got about 240 employees. They're getting better results so far than teams more than twice that size. So certainly questions have been raised. You might understand why that's the case. This I thought was also kind of interesting. So now the way that, the whole cost cap is going into effect, the budget and wind tunnel time are limited for some of the top squads. That means Haas had more of this wind tunnel time. They also took on about 25 engineers from Ferrari who had to dismantle their team to a degree because of the cost cap. So that's the thing, right? There are some engineers that have come over from Ferrari to Haas this past, season, a couple of seasons really, which, could have, of course, brought across some ideas that maybe they were discussing internally. Not, of course, guarantees. Haas are, of course, going to deny that, as are any of these teams actually. Well, they're going to deny that they even asked the FIA to look into this, but some of them apparently have. So as even as Gunter Steiner says, anyone who wants to get in there has to use their own entrance. Our computer systems are completely separate. No Formula 1 employee from Ferrari comes in there, right? So saying, look, we're completely separate to Ferrari. We've got completely different ideas, the way we've come up with things. Now, of course, look, the fact of the matter is Ferrari now fighting for victories, Haas all of a sudden in the points twice. The doubters are going to return. Is it possible that Ferrari and Haas both rely on similar concepts, long, wide and high side pods, slim airbox, or like, is that concept that they just came up with themselves, or has there been some discussions between the engineers maybe that came over, or some just additional sharing beyond what actually is allowed? As is described right here, when Ferrari and many other teams switched to the 2022 project in June, Haas was already in the second stage development of the VF22. The first development stage with the slim side pods, similar to Mercedes, McLaren and Williams, was discarded. They went down the Ferrari route at that point. There was of course further discussion then from the team bosses. So this is what Toto Wolff has to say. Haas took a huge leap forward from last place. It's an interesting step. It's been a learning curve for us, because as an organisation of 2,000 people that has been successful in the past, we're now struggling with teams that are much smaller. They must have done a great job, he says with a wink. Kind of, implying that, look, maybe something's going on here, right? Saying that, must have done a really great job, guys. You have like a tenth of our people, but yet you're producing a similarly good car. Like something must be going on here, effectively, is the implication. At the same time, Wolff is calling for a reform of the rules. The change in personnel between the two teams, the physical proximity, the infrastructure used, creates points of contention that are not good for our sport, right? Yes, good Steiner might say that you might have to access these things through separate entrances and stuff, but yes, that like the proximity is a point of contention. We have been sharing the wind tunnel for Aston Martin for 2 years. 2 years ago, like it caused some sort of problems, although everything was going as normal. But if you do a good job, you should be recognised for it and not doubted. That's why we need to find solutions in the future that prevent too close cooperation between the teams. They're saying, look, I want to give Haas the credit, but I can't just because of, these issues in the infrastructure and physical proximity. Now, of course, look, Günther Steiner's had his response to this, because of course last weekend they didn't have quite the result in Australia. The implication was there, like some people were suggesting, that maybe Ferrari turned down the power to the Haas team so that they didn't have the result, so that they kind of, these theories would go away as to the fact that they're kind of giving them too much advantage, or the sharing and stuff, because like if Haas stayed as good as they were in Australia, these ideas would be even more prevalent maybe than they already are. So the theory was that they'd somehow turn down the power. I highly doubt that's the case, and as Günther Steiner says, what nonsense effectively. But still, the FIA investigations, the FIA have been asked to look into this. Apparently 3 teams out of 4 that we'll dive into here in a second want them to look into it. They're not going to admit internally that they did this, but apparently that is the case. And even as Andreas Seidel says from McLaren, for us it's a question of principle. 2 teams should not have more than the engine and internals of the gearbox in common. There shouldn't be any sharing of infrastructure. We know from the FIA that it is impossible to monitor all forms of potential transfers. What you can't control should be forbidden. The danger is sharing information will make the B team better, while it is helping the A team as well. So that's what the teams have to say. Now, 3 teams out of the 4 of McLaren, Aston Martin, Alpine and Mercedes, which kind of makes sense when you look at the standings and you look at where these squads were last year compared to this season around. Like, 3 at least of these 4 have seemingly put in a question really to the FIA to say, look, have a look into this to make sure there's nothing going on. Like, and these are some of the quotes, of course, that came out. So interesting one. Of course, I'm convinced the FIA will investigate this case, come to the right conclusions about how similar these 2 cars are. There are some similarities. There are also some differences. Wonder what the FIA will come up with. But it's a strange world, isn't it, where some of these teams are scared of the Haas effectively after the last couple of years we've had. This I thought was a pretty cold quote actually from Günther Steiner as a result of this. Like saying he doesn't really care if people call the Haas for the white Ferrari. You have to work hard for envy. You get pity for free. So pretty hard quote to be honest here from Günther, because effectively he's saying, look, last year we were so bad. It was like, poor Haas, all this type of stuff. Nowadays we're actually looking good. We've worked hard. We've got a great car. And the envy is coming in effectively from the other teams. That's why they're trying to call us cheaters effectively to the FIA. So we shall see, I suppose, how this one develops. Of course, look, they did have a tough Australia. That could be for many reasons. Similar in a way to the fact that McLaren said their car just suited that track way better than it suited Bahrain. They go from like P13 in that means the McLaren guys right in Bahrain to all of a sudden fighting for top 4, ending up with some pretty solid points, of course, in Australia as well. So kind of change of fortunes for those 2 squads. I guess we'll see how things progress. Wanted to mention a couple of things about Ferrari real quick. This actually, of course, Charles Leclerc gets a 320k watch stolen in Italy yesterday. So kind of crazy stuff. Glad he's okay, but I think he was getting like mobbed by a crowd or something. Someone just nicked it off his wrist. He's asking the police to look into it. But look, if you're going around with a 320k watch, I guess he's probably got enough cash to recover from this one. But yeah, not ideal at all. This also though, because yesterday I believe, or maybe the day before, we talked about the new floor that Ferrari might be bringing. Seems like that's not going to arrive to Imola. Makes sense, I suppose, right? Because they don't want to make too many changes, because they've only got one FP1 session in which it might be raining anyway to try and test this stuff out. So apparently some small anti-porpoising adaptations. We saw that was kind of their main issue in Australia, despite winning the race comfortably, Charles Leclerc. So I guess we'll see if they make some slight tweaks here that might make them even better. But still, a new floor is seemingly on the way for them as well to deal with the porpoising, as it is for Mercedes. Seemingly not going to arrive quite as of yet though. This also from Carlos Sainz kind of pointing out one key issue they're looking to find performance in, that being of course the straight line speed. To some degree this might be affected by the porpoising, at the same time that maybe they're also thinking about turning up the engine a little bit, because we know they have more in the tank here in this engine. Apparently 10 horsepower extra they can at least bring into the engine for the second time around that they do, like the second engine they bring through in a few races time with their reliability upgrades they attempt to make to the engine. But who knows, right, if they need to get some sort of straight line speed advantage over the Red Bull, which of course was very strong in Jeddah, depending on the track and the circuit, then maybe they'll turn it up even sooner than that. This also on this day 2009, obviously what, 13 years ago at this point, kind of crazy stuff, Sebastian Vettel won his only second Grand Prix of his career, securing Red Bull their first F1 win. Of course, yeah, going on to win a crazy streak of victories and of course world titles over the next few years. And this is what I thought was just kind of interesting. Lead changes in each race. Bahrain Grand Prix was 6, Saudi Arabian Grand Prix with 4, Australian Grand Prix 0, because Charles Leclerc dominated from start to finish. But very much intrigued to your thoughts on all this stuff in the comment section below. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did enjoy it, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Thanks for watching as always. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you next time.